Thank you, sir. Roger, I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to come and talk about agriculture. It's something that I'm very passionate about. I've been involved in agriculture for most of my adult life in some form. And I want to give you a little bit of background on our geography, and so you'll kind of have a better perspective of where I am coming from. In East Arkansas, I call it the East Coast of Arkansas. If you're familiar with Arkansas, we're right across the river from Tennessee and Mississippi. My district is, we have more Mississippi River frontage than any district in the nation. In fact, my district runs from Missouri to Louisiana along the Mississippi River and then further inland. And we are a very intensely agricultural region. Primarily, what we're known for in Arkansas, in fact, my district is responsible for 50% roughly of the U.S. rice crop. So we are known for rice production. And we also are number 3 in cotton production. Now, there's an interesting dynamic, a cultural dynamic that I think I should share with you, that we kind of identify ourselves as rice farmers or cotton farmers, depending on which side of Crowley's Ridge you're on, because the soil profile is a little different. So we're rice farmers or we're cotton farmers, but we grow more soybeans than anything. And so it's an interesting thing that our idea of diversity is cotton, rice, soybeans, wheat, corn, grain, sorghum. And that compares or contrasts a little bit with what you're used to seeing in places like California. California being probably the most diverse ag economy in the country, if not the world. And so what we have is economies of scale in large number. So we see in our neck of the woods, it's very common to see 20,000 acre operations. In fact, it's very uncommon to see operations less than 1,000 acres. Those days are gone, and the reason they're gone is largely due to technology, in the advent of technology, in particular in the last 15, 20 years. And so it's interesting to see that while here we are in Silicon Valley, and we're in such a diverse ag economy in the state of California, so much of the technology that you may be familiar with is maybe a little more applicable here, or at least the perception may be that it's more applicable in places like California. In fact, we're doing an awful lot with technology, and we have some barriers to it, but we also have shown some great progress. One of the things that has led to consolidation and greater economies of scale, as I mentioned, is technology. One of the things that you see almost every operator in our neck of the woods doing, and that's called variable rate technology, where we're mapping mapping fields and doing grid sampling in the soil profile, and you get a prescription for that grid square, and then you can minimize your costs on inputs. You can directly target soil temperature and seed depth and seeding rate and all those things that happen to maximize your efficiency, because in a thin margin endeavor like agriculture, margin is what it's all about. We're on thin margins. And so maximize productivity, improve margins. And ultimately, I think the end game is for everybody is to try and produce a cheap, safe, abundant food source for the American consumer. But keep in mind, of course, that farming is a business, and you've got to stay in business, and you got to make a profit. And there really should be no shame in farmers seeking to make a profit. And so I think that's something that's been lost in this endeavor as well, that farmers are, certainly it's a noble calling to serve your fellow man as an agricultural producer, no question about it. But it also costs money, and there's a large investment in it, and technology certainly plays a role in that. And we need to understand that agriculture producers, whatever they're producing, should be expected to make a profit and should utilize the tools at their disposal to do that. And so it's a privilege to be with you today to talk about ag technology, some of the things that you're experiencing, some of the things that I can relate to you that we're experiencing in my geography. And so I won't talk any longer except to say thank you, and certainly be open to any questions or comments that you might have about large-scale agriculture in East Arkansas.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll let you have a seat. So thanks very much for coming out. And this is mostly a California crowd. It's somewhat of an international crowd, no doubt. But I think a lot of the people in this crowd are used to marketing to the California, row crop industry. But sometimes we have to be reminded that the world's a big place, and there are crops other than just California crops. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the agricultural market is like out in your part of the world.
Well, as I mentioned, we are mostly what you would consider program crops: rice, cotton, soybeans, wheat, corn, and grain sorghum. And so, you mentioned the global marketplace, and sometimes I have to remind farmers occasionally when they get so locked into what it is they're doing at home, at the turn row level, that just as an example, every fourth row of soybeans is going to China. When you plant a seed, and certainly that's true in Arkansas, and it's true in other parts of the country, when you plant a seed, if you're a farmer, you are in a global business. And so you have to adopt sort of a global perspective. We are sort of confined to that market of those program crops. And so it's difficult in terms of, thinking about ag markets beyond just those traditional program crops, because that's essentially our model. But I just think that we certainly have to remind farmers every day that even though you're planting a crop in, Poinsett County, Arkansas, you're planting that crop for a global marketplace.
It's interesting to hear you say that, especially the reference to China, because China certainly looms large here in the valley. It's a huge destination for a lot of the exports out of this country, but also for a lot of the agricultural technology. In fact, it's kind of surprising just how much it seems to me to be so much easier the adoption of technology is in China than it is here. What's been your experience? I know you got a lot of experience with AgTech. You're one of the few, in fact, you're one of the few people in Congress or the Senate that actually understands the tech side of agriculture. Can you maybe comment on what you've seen as barriers to adoption?
Yeah, there's a lot of regulatory barriers, and there are some fears. I will tell you this, that you mentioned this in Congress. We are, myself and one other member, this is a bipartisan effort, we're going to launch the AgTech caucus in the House of Representatives to specifically address policy that is driven by and toward ag technology. Because right now, when you look at the Farm Bill, there's very little, if any, reference to technology. So technology is certainly a force multiplier in productivity and otherwise for farmers, and they need to be utilizing that. And there probably needs to be some incentives for farmers. Right now, there are barriers that prevent farmers from adopting technology. Some of it's regulatory, some of it is simply the investment that it takes to do. But what we need is more attention paid to that from a policy perspective. So we're kind of, we're going to drive that direction so that when we tee up the next Farm Bill, which is, I can't believe it's already almost time to start discussing the next Farm Bill. But what we want to do is talk about that and bring technology into the debate. So we're doing that to prepare ourselves for a better Farm Bill that is, that technology is certainly part of that equation. I think, so we have the regulatory barrier that is a problem. Then we have certainly the ability, and I was having a conversation this morning about this, people have the capacity, the intellectual capacity to do almost anything. It's a question of resources. It's a question of access. So in rural communities, rural broadband, I'm passionate about that. We are behind the curve with respect to delivering connectivity to rural communities. Now this issue, for me, and I think for our country, is the same issue that we faced as a nation in the 20s and 30s with rural electrification. That was a game changer. It leveled the playing field, improved quality of life, and really, changed our social and cultural culture in this country. Well, connectivity can do that too. Now, the reason I say that the intellectual capacity is sort of worth talking about, if you're an individual who's brought up in the Silicon Valley in California, you have access to a lot of technology and a lot of resources. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have a higher IQ. It just means you have access to greater technology and greater resources, and then your life experiences and your opportunity will reflect that. You take somebody who is equally intelligent and has the IQ that's the same IQ as this individual, and you plop them down in DeWitt, Arkansas. They don't have the resources. They don't have the technology. They don't have the same ability and opportunity to pursue those technological avenues. Therefore, they're not going to achieve at the same level. Doesn't mean they're any less intelligent. The intellectual capacity is not a problem in this country. It's access and connectivity that, to me, prevents us from advancing to the next level. And so connectivity in rural America is going to be a huge issue.
Let's pause on that for a minute. You know, out here in Silicon Valley, I think most people tend to believe that government can have a role in advancing industry. Sometimes that role might be just to kind of get out of the way. Other times it might be to level the playing field. But I'm wondering, what is the legislative ask that we should have, especially on connectivity? You know, last year Bruce Rastetter sat on the stage with me, and he said they had a program in Iowa where they had planned on wiring an entire state. Every single acre would be connected, was their goal. Is there something like that in Arkansas, and is there something that Congress can do to aid that?
We're working on something legislatively, but the reality is that because you have sparse population, you know, scattered around the country, you don't have, for example, you don't have the ability to bond, that investment. You know, so in a major metropolitan area, when you want to improve infrastructure, you go to the taxpayers, the ratepayers, or whatever, and you say, hey, we want to do this bond initiative, and here's the payback method, and that's great because you have the population and the tax base to do it. In rural America, you don't have that. And so I'm looking at trying to figure out some sort of way to utilize an investment vehicle for rural Americans to take part in to address things like connectivity and internet infrastructure that would otherwise be cost prohibitive. I haven't arrived at that solution yet, but I'm thinking in that direction. You've got municipal bonds. How do we come up with something that rural communities could do collectively, collaboratively, to help create a broader base for a repayment type of a model that allows the private sector to participate and not 100% rely on the government? This is a huge lift for the federal government. We're $19 trillion in debt. How do we go now and find the resources to do something that's very important for this country, but that we simply have to prioritize? If we don't have private sector collaboration and some vehicle to facilitate that, then again, we're going to see rural America left behind. So what I'm trying to do is create, if nothing else, a platform for ideas so that we can sort of sit around and talk about what can we do to invest in from the private sector and have that supported to some degree from the federal government. Okay.
So let's talk about a couple of possible technologies. I'm really kind of intrigued by this idea of an AgTech subcommittee on the Agriculture Committee. I think it's long overdue, and I applaud you for taking leadership on that. Last time I was in Washington, I met with Senator John Hoeven, and he had introduced a bill that would make private the GPS data, that all these cars are gathering on you because there's GPS in all your cars now. But did you know that the GPS, it started in tractors, and that's where it was first used. And it occurs to me that might be a place we might see some regulation in Washington. Just privacy, because farmers, of course, are very concerned about their data and who's getting it and who's using it. Is that something we might expect to see, or are there other areas?
Yeah, I mentioned regulatory barriers, and there's also the cultural barrier that exists with, farmers in rural America are typically sort of a little standoffish and very private, tend to be. And what we've seen is that they have the ability to collect data, and it's in their interest to collect data, and certainly for the application of and its use on their farm. The sharing of big data is a little different implication there, and it has people a little concerned. And we've seen some incidents where USDA has either inadvertently or otherwise released information to other groups that had private information on, and even as much as Social Security numbers of farmers. That's a huge breach of privacy, but it's also a breach of trust. And this sort of feeds that notion that we can't trust the federal government. So farmers have that sort of, mistrust on the front end that's built into the culture. So how do we overcome that? Well, I'm not sure that we can if we don't start to change things from a regulatory standpoint to protect the privacy of those folks that we're actually supposed to serve. And so we've got to address that, because that's certainly a barrier to adopting technology in a meaningful way. Data is hugely important to farmers, and they know this. Now, it's also important to the folks in the ancillary industry that serves agriculture. If we can deliver a product in real time based on data that they're collecting in real time, it's much more meaningful to the farmer, rather than looking at a 5-year history and trying to project where we should be with a given product at a given time. That's a little bit like Wayne Gretzky said, I don't go where the puck is, I go where the puck is supposed to be. That's kind of how we ought to be positioned in agriculture, and data helps us do that. The problem is we have to manage that and balance that with the respect of privacy, not only the respect for privacy, but the legal obligation we have to not breach an individual's privacy. And I know that there was a big one that the USDA was involved in and the EPA was involved in, and we were, very proactive in trying to police that and to protect the farmers, because that is a barrier to technology, because there's a level of fear there. So that's something that we have to address as well.
I feel like I have my own private audience with Congress here. I can kind of gripe about my own stuff. So let me talk about really three things that I think might resonate with our audience. So number one, I think a lot of people in the audience are a little frustrated with the rules around drone technology and what the FAA has done there, and we're wondering if there might be some room for legislative intervention. Well, let's just let you respond to that.
Well, this is something that I've been really trying to very aggressively address. Now, here's what we find when we're talking about drones, UAVs. They have immediate application in agriculture production, very useful tools. The problem is we see the use of UAVs in ways that are problematic, and certainly in areas, major metropolitan areas where they have tightly controlled airspace, and then we see an accident that happens and you've got a drone strike, and the next thing you know, FAA is screaming about, well, we've got to restrict drone use. I understand that there should be some regulation to this controlled airspace, completely. But what we've done in the state of Arkansas, and I'm hoping that we're laying the template to do this nationwide, is that the industry has taken steps to police itself. And I'll give you an example. What we came up with in Arkansas was what we call a CAP task force. I love acronyms, so bear with me. CAP, C-A-A-P, Coordinated Agricultural Airspace Protocol, CAP task force. What we did is we got crop consultants, we got farmers, and we got tech companies, the ones that are developing the UAVs and fielding these in the market, brought them all to the table, as well as our extension personnel, so ag professionals, the education folks. And we said, what do we have to do to police ourselves and implement policy that doesn't lend ourselves to the scrutiny and regulation of the federal government? And they're all willing to work together, proactively, preemptively, to protect the viability of use of UAVs in this agricultural airspace. Is this going to apply to major metropolitan areas? Absolutely not. But we shouldn't throw out this template for DFW or JFK Airport and apply that to Stuttgart, Arkansas. So that was the reason, and that's why I think most states could benefit from a proactive approach to trying to manage airspace within their state.
I think you really hit on something when you talk about applying laws that apply to the old economy to kind of the new technologies. And I'd like to give you two examples where I think the government is maybe inadvertently picking winners and losers here. One is satellite technology. There are a lot of VCs in this valley who are ready to bet on satellite technology, but the law has not kept up with the technology. It has prohibited satellite imagery from being as precise and distinct as it could be. The other one, and this is a big deal here in the Silicon Valley, is the gig economy. And we've been hearing about this a lot because there's a presidential race, although I'm not sure the candidates disagree anymore on this. But the gig economy is big in the valley, and there are technologies out there that enable farmers to talk to farmers, farmers to talk directly to consumers, technologies like that. And it seems to me that there's going to be a lot of changes coming up. There's going to be a lot of new issues and a lot of very tough issues as the law has to keep up with the new technologies.
Well, I think you're right. I think there is a tendency by the federal government to engage in maybe not a directly, overtly picking winners and losers, but in effect, when you over-regulate, when you over-legislate, there is a dynamic there that's present of winners and losers. So that's something that we have to work on. But I would, in the limited time we have left, I hope that if nothing else, we can understand this. We have over 300 million people in this country that we are responsible for feeding and clothing. We have to rely on technology in that endeavor. Absolutely have to. Because they're making all kinds of things new and improved, but what they're not making new is land. So those land resources are becoming more and more scarce. So they have to become more and more productive, and we have to be more and more proactive in how we address producing food and fiber for just this country, but also keeping in mind that we want to be a participant in the global marketplace as well. So technology fits right in that lane.
We have time for one question from the audience. Anybody want to ask? Okay, right over here.
To repeat the question there, he was asking about biofuel feedstocks, particularly ethanol, switchgrass, and other feedstocks that they're looking at and not looking at corn stover. Look, I understand. I'll tell you this. I'm one of the guys that's in the ag industry that says we probably ought to rethink ethanol in the context of what it does when you have half of your corn crop going into fuel versus the food chain. So corn stover is a more efficient converter of energy, uses less water, and you get a better yield on it. So the byproduct is just as effective as the actual crop, but we're not doing damage to the market basket, for lack of a better term. So I do think that we ought to be looking at things beyond just the corn itself with the corn stover. There's been a lot of research done on switchgrass, wood chips, and a variety of other feedstocks for ethanol. But I agree with you. I think corn stover is just as productive, and it's a much better value proposition if we're going to continue to look at biofuels as long-term viability.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our time. I really want to thank you, Congressman Crawford. It's been very enlightening. It's great to see there are people in Washington at the highest levels who understand what we're doing here and are taking, again, leadership to move this forward and creating committees that can advance our industry. So thank you very much, Congressman Crawford.
Yes.